Are you looking for inspiring conversations about faith, film, and life? You're in the right place. Here's the host who knows the right questions to ask, Father Edward Looney.
Hey everybody, it's Father Edward. Grateful you're tuning in for another conversation. And today I want to help you prepare for Lent, but really for the rest of your life as well. Tan Books has their book of the year, and this year it's The Sinner's Guide by Louis of Granada. So this is a classic in the spiritual life, and I'm very excited to be speaking with Dominican Father Basil Cole today to speak more about Louis of Granada and what we can learn from the Sinner's Guide. So thanks so much, Father Basil, for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so I think first things first, we have to learn who Louis of Granada is. So maybe could you situate us a little bit in history with a little bit of his backstory? When did he live? Where did he live and such?
Sure. Well, he lived in the 16th century, was born on the same year as St. Pius V, of all things. Though we didn't know him, to my knowledge. He might have. He was born into a very difficult situation because he was poor and his father dies when he's 6. So mom and he basically are beggars, on the street. And he decides to become a Dominican and goes to the novitiate nearby. And they discover that he's got a brain. So after 4 years of studying philosophy and a little theology, they send him to Valladolid in Spain, where great masters had taught there. I'm thinking of the founder of international law, whose name escapes me right now, and a few other great Dominicans. And he does exceedingly well, but he wants to become a missionary. And one of the popes, whose again name I forget, decides to let all friars who wish to go to the new land permission to go and evangelize without the permission of their provincials, which was kind of crazy. But anyway, so he's all set to go. He's ready ready there in Lisbon, I believe, was where the boats were, and he's doing a little preaching. By this time, he's well known as kind of well known as a preacher, but nothing super. And at the last moment, the new pope changes his mind, and the provincial grabs him away and shoves him to Cordoba, where he basically preaches a lot of places in Spain and also close to the border of Portugal. Well, the king and the queen in Portugal hear about him, and the cardinal, etc. And so all of a sudden, within a few years, he's made provincial of all things, Portugal. And now he's well known as a spiritual director to the royalty there, as well as a preacher to all kinds of people, especially to ordinary people. And he starts writing up a storm, not scientific works, but works for the average person. In fact, somebody criticized him for writing for wives of carpenters. And his response was, well, that was certainly the Blessed Mother was the wife of a carpenter. Anyway, he starts out with the fundamental principle that can be discovered in St. Thomas, but it's not so evident, that everybody is called to holiness. And that was slightly unusual, even though he knows mostly religious and priests who are very holy. John of the Cross knows him. Teresa of Avila knows him. Even the doctor of the church, John of Avila, knows who he is. And there's all kinds of saints. And he also, now that he's in Portugal, he even helps the Jesuits get established there. And there's a Jesuit saint who has a great fondness for him, again, whose name escapes me at the moment. So he's, wandering around all kinds of preaching and writing up a storm. Um, and all of a sudden, the Pope wants to make him a cardinal, and he has to turn that down. The king and queen want him to become the Archbishop of Braga and another episcopal see, and he turns those things down. He just wants to live the simple life of a preacher and an author, and that's what he does. Over the years, he wrote something like, I have it here, 49 books on the spiritual life. And he's got over 25 languages, 6,000 editions of his work. He's especially well known for his Spanish style, which apparently influenced the Spanish language. I don't know how, I don't know Spanish. At the same time, he's also influencing indirectly through others the Council of Trent, who become from especially Bartholomew of the Martyrs, a Dominican cardinal who's a friend of his. And also, he winds up putting in Spanish the Catechism of the Council of Trent, which is also very important and popular. Allegedly, I've seen this in secondary literature. He also was involved in doing some writing on the ninth and the 10th commandment of the Council of Trent, but I'm not sure, I don't have any primary sources on that one. So he proceeds to just basically make an extraordinary name for himself. And even when he turns blind, he's writing by dictating his works to others, and then eventually passes away into obscurity. He becomes a venerable, never becomes a blessed or a saint. For one reason being no miracles, to my knowledge. So that's one of the principal things if you're going to become a venerable. When you're going to become a blessed, you've got to have a miracle. No miracle. Well, that was true with the Fra Angelico. He had no miracles either, but his paintings were extraordinary. And so he eventually was declared a blessed by John Paul II. This man could probably be declared a doctor of the Church of the laypersons because his writings influenced people all over the world, including the Japanese who were being persecuted during the time of the 200 years. They were reading his stuff. And ordinary people were reading his stuff all the time. And because it's understandable. It's clear. He writes smoothly and brilliantly, and at the same time cites the scriptures that anybody can understand, cites fathers of the church that anybody can understand. Occasionally throws in Aquinas, but he's not writing a commentary on Aquinas. He knows Aquinas. He has to know Aquinas because he studied under some great Dominican commentators who were brilliant guys, but he didn't go that route of scientifically going into dogma and moral. He went into the route of writing books that would inspire. And so that's his legacy. These incredible inspirations in all these languages. Even Rose of Lima, and down in South America, she's reading him in an Indian language. I mean, that's how widespread his writings became, not only in that century, but throughout the centuries as well. He's sort of like what the imitation of Christ is, he is to, the rest of the world.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. And of course, Tan Books has made this their book of the year. So they're doing a lot of promotion, want to get in the hands of a lot of the faithful to discover his writings. This is just one of his 49 books that he wrote. And I'm curious, so the Sinner's Guide, is this the name that he gave to the book, or is this the name that Tan Books has given in a republication of it?
Oh no, this was his guide. Let's see. Just the Sinner's Guide. That's him. Period. He you could be falsely, you could falsely assume that, well, he's telling people how to sin, how to guide sinners to sin. No, no, no. He's guiding sinners to get out of sin. But for some reason, that's the way it stands, the sinner's guide. I would have named it differently, but oh, I'm nobody.
Well, you're somebody, Father. So, as we're talking about The Sinner's Guide by Louis of Granada, yeah, one of the things I realize, at least in my ministry as a priest, is that sometimes I can talk to someone and they tell me that they really have no need of confession, that they don't commit sins, and all of this. So there's kind of this lack of awareness of individuals regarding the nature of sin, what sin is, what is a sin that they're committing in their life. Everybody wants to think that they're perfect, but the reality is we're all sinners. So, how can we maybe better become aware of our own sinfulness?
Well, the independent of Louis Granada for just a moment, we can become aware of our sinfulness when we read the Catechism of the Catholic Church and see that it's right there, right in your face, that you're not perfect. Only Christ and Mary were perfect. Maybe John the Baptist, maybe Joseph. But other than that, we sin 7 times a day. The problem is we don't want to look at the negative side of ourselves. We want to balloon out our talents and our abilities, and that's why he has to talk about the capital vice of pride and vainglory, because that's really at the heart of people who come to confession and say, "Bless me, Father, for I have not sinned. You tell me what I've done wrong and I'll defend myself." Well, that's basically the vice of pride, and he's got it in there quite well. And vainglory, they both go together for Louis of Granada and for the Council of Trent. Thomas Aquinas is a little different. He tends to call pride the queen of the vices, and then the property of pride is vainglory. And then he goes on. But anyway, the Council of Trent just calls it pride.
Well, he treats the topic of conversion, and
Yeah.
one of the points listed about the sinner's guide is that he cautions against deferring conversion.
Oh, yes.
Quite interestingly, one of the cardinals of the church, Cardinal Tobin, recently wrote a pastoral letter on conversion, but it was more of like conversion of thought to a synodal way of the church.
Mhm.
And when I saw this, pastoral letter on conversion, I thought, well, this really isn't the way that Bernard of Clairvaux or others spoke of conversion. It's not probably the way Jesus spoke of conversion. Like their idea of conversion was go and sin no more. And so, so on the topic of conversion, I think sometimes we defer conversion because I hesitate reading the scriptures because if I read the scriptures, it might call me to live differently, and I'm not ready to live differently, so I'm not going to do that. Or if I pray in adoration, well, maybe the Lord's going to ask me to do something, change something, and I'm not ready for that aspect of conversion. So, well, what is this remedy to conversion that Louis of Granada offers?
Well, being a Thomist himself, the remedy that there's, first of all, proximate and remote remedies throughout the entire book. Well, one of the major remedies for conversion is that you can die at any time, of course, and that you won't get there. You wind up going to damnation. And he's got a lot of stuff. Got a number of, not a lot, but he's got a number of insights into damnation and hell and even purgatory itself. However, he also maintains that in order to accomplish conversion, you need the help of God's grace. You can't do it on your own. I can't say, I'm going to convert today. If I want to do anything, I'm going to convert today with God's grace, with God's help. Once I get that into my mind, then I'm no longer thinking that I'm the cause of my salvation, but together with our blessed Lord, we work at turning aside from disordered acts, from mortal sin, and venial sin, and develop a relationship with Christ. Now, turning away from sin is one thing. Turning towards a loving relationship with God is another thing. They both require one another, but just simply turning away from sin isn't enough. Simply turning to Jesus isn't enough if you're not going to change your life at all. I love Jesus, but I also love, I love to drink.
Sure. So speaking of, that, of course, there are deadly sins, and we could list the seven deadly sins, but we also know that there are corresponding virtues. So where there is vice, then we strive to practice virtue. So, what are some of the takeaways about the seven deadly sins, and how can we maybe correct them with the virtuous life?
Well, first of all, a good chunk of the book is an attempt to motivate you to want to grow in virtue. He speaks, for example, I'll answer your question, but
Okay.
this is like to get you to whet your appetite. First, there's what he calls the privileges of grace. Okay. And that's to motivate you to want to get in a state of grace. And he goes through from motives. He goes through approximately 11 motives of why you want to practice virtue in the first place. Okay. Then he goes into the privileges that you receive from God as a result of trying to grow in virtue: consolations, a good conscience, confidence, etc., etc., etc. Now, when you kind of understand where you're going when you get into heaven, and you understand how God is inspiring you to get there, and that's called grace, baptism, growing in virtue, etc. All the gifts that God pours out that we don't deserve, that we don't merit, but are pure gifts. Okay, then what happens? All right. Then when you see your enemies are within yourself, then you have the motivation to want to defang as much as you can the major enemies of the spiritual life, namely the capital vices, as St. Thomas calls them, and as he calls them, the deadly sins. When you notice you have arrogance within you, you're not necessarily committing a sin. You know that you've got something that's an obstacle, and you sort of pray it out as best as you can. And that leads you to try to grow into humility, see, which is kind of right after faith, hope, and charity. It almost looks like a fourth theological virtue, but it's not. It's a virtue that then enables you to recognize your limitations and also the capital vices that are growling within your soul. See, the more you recognize that, then the more you take up the cudgels to fight against them. And then there are ways of fighting against them, having learned privileges, having learned the gifts that you've been given. And then you want to keep those gifts, obviously. You don't want to lose them. And that leads you then to want to kind of carry on this battle with yourself. That's sort of the way he's going.
Sure. And so, by identifying kind of those vices, those deadly sins, then we can create this motivation for conversion and want to practice the virtuous life. So, yeah, I could see why so many, holy people, as you mentioned before, would have recommended him. And in fact, I saw that St. Francis de Sales recommended Venerable Louis's
Yes.
work to be read as a second breviary.
Yeah.
So almost
Yes.
to read it every day. So
Yeah.
I'm curious about your life as a Dominican father. Have you read and encountered Louis of Granada's work previously? And
Oh, yeah.
and was he a writer that you would have read in formation and all that? So he's been really integrated into your Dominican life.
Well, yes. When I was a first year philosopher, I started reading. I didn't read the book that we're thinking about, The Sinner's Guide. I read some of the selections that were called a Summa of the Christian Life that were edited by Jordan Ullman, 3 volumes. And they kind of inspired me. And then I never went back to him. I never read him at all for all these years. I had no idea of, I knew who he was. I knew how important he was, but I was pulled to other writings, and especially being a young Dominican, I had to study St. Thomas so much that it kind of pushed a lot of things out. And I didn't particularly enjoy reading Thomas Aquinas. I found it boring, boring, boring. It wasn't until I was a priest that all of a sudden I got a conversion to St. Thomas Aquinas. Then I had to teach him, etc. So when I was asked by Tan to go around and talk about Louis of Granada, well, then I read practically all of his works in English that we have. And then all of a sudden I got, shall we say, inspired again. And I understood how important he was, especially since it's so easy to understand. You don't have to be a wunderkind. It's so simple. And unlike Aquinas, who's more abstract, he's more concrete. He's always giving examples that anybody can understand. Thomas doesn't give lots of examples. He presumes you've got the brains to understand him, since you've had a lot of philosophy and all that other stuff. You see, so for me, he's the Johnny come lately, but at the same time, he inspired me when I was young.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful to hear. And, hopefully as Tandem Books as designating this as their book of the year, that he can really inspire other people. He had this, as you mentioned earlier, he was known for preaching to the laity. So he is understandable. It's not, you need a theology degree to read him. So anybody can really appreciate him, as you said. So I think that's a great value as, I think we're seeing in our time a great interest of people of wanting to grow in their knowledge of the faith and deepen their spiritual life. That, Ascension Press puts out the Bible in a year and the Catechism in a year and now the Rosary in a year. Like there is this hunger for people that they're seeking more. And so I think, as you do the Bible and the Catechism, well, that leads you to some of these great holy writers that the church has been blessed with over the centuries. And that includes Louis of Granada. So, yeah, I think he would be a great resource. I think during Lent, this is a time when we're specifically to focus on conversion of life and growth in virtue and conforming to Christ and such. So I think this could be a great Lenten read for someone this year.
Yeah. When I was younger and living in Rome, I had to go through the catechism because a bad translation was made. And so I had to kind of correct a lot of that stuff. I was a team of 4 originally, and then a team of 10. But when I look back on it, it fed me very, very much. It spoke to me a lot. But for most people, the Catechism of the Catholic Church is a little heady, a little more, it's kind of slightly boring unless you have a mind for that kind of a thing. Whereas the Sinner's Guide can lead you to the Catechism. I have a feeling that the Catechism wouldn't lead you to the Sinner's Guide. I think you just, after a few minutes of reading the Catechism, you put it aside. Just like the Catechism of the Council of Trent. Hardly anybody reads it anymore. It's brilliant as well. But the Sinner's Guide, it appeals to your emotions a little more, whereas the catechisms appeal mostly to the intellect. And you might get an emotional hit here and there if you're an intellectual, but if you're not an intellectual, it doesn't serve you as well as the Sinner's Guide. But eventually you can go to the Catechism and probably learn a lot as a result of the Sinner's Guide. As you grow in virtue and grace, then you become more and more apt to understand more rarefied things, even Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, so Father, you are very well read. You are a great scholar and such. So I'm just wondering, maybe what's one takeaway from the Sinner's Guide, or your reading from Louis of Granada in preparation for your little press tour for him. Like, what's one big insight that you've taken away from him?
One big insight. Oh boy, there's so many insights. Let me. I don't want to. I would say that in the in the beginning there, something that struck me very much was the ninth motive for practicing virtue, the thought of heaven.
Hmm.
Quite often, we don't think enough about heaven. We can think a tad about hell, it's easier. We can think a tad about purgatory, but thinking about heaven is kind of difficult because we might know it's like being with God. Well, I'm already with God. So what's the difference? Well, if I have some learning, I'll know it's the beatific vision. I may not know what the word beatific means, but it means happiness. So, but what's interesting though is that the more you understand a little bit your ultimate goal, then you will take the means that Louis of Granada teaches you in his wonderful book, The Sinner's Guide. Even though that particular chapter is kind of in the middle of the book, if you begin with that, you'd want to say, yeah, I want to get into heaven because I see that when I'm in heaven, I am in complete total bliss of of joy, of love, of understanding. I see God, I see Mary, I see Jesus, I see my friends, I see my saints, I see my angels, etc. And then if you follow Louis of Granada's take on heaven, well, then you realize, well, I want to be there. I want to get there, but I'm weak. Then you see, well, what are some of the things that God's given you so that you can overcome your weakness? Then you go start looking in Louis' book. The thing about the Sinner's Guide, you can begin anywhere there and you will be inspired. I don't care if it's chapter 48 or chapter 8. Normally, we'd start with one and just slowly work through the book. But this is written in such a fashion that each chapter is almost independently well written and inspiring. But especially this thing on heaven is most inspiring to me. Yeah, I could be all wet here. Maybe somebody will read something about hell, that'll inspire them. But for me, it was on heaven. And so when you realize that, it's like if you have a goal and you want to get to the goal, you will try to find the best means to get to the goal. And a lot of the means that Louis Granada talks about are easily obtainable independent of the sacraments. Inner means for prayer and meditating, thinking about being, desiring to be able to be more faithful to your parents, to be more faithful to your wife, your children, et cetera, and your duties and all those things don't seem so difficult the more you want the goal, the end, the end. And so that for me is probably the chapter that touches me the most.
No, it's very beautiful. Of course, heaven being the motivating factor of everything in our life, really. And earlier you mentioned too, he said something about just remember, the motive for conversion, like remember that death could come for you at any moment. And, I'm often reminded of that. Just, there was one time where driving down the highway, I witnessed a fatal car accident take
Oh,
place. And so that's one of those moments where you realize like life is fleeting, or in that old adage, memento mori, remember death. So
mhm,
all of these little adages or pious thoughts can really help us in cultivating a spiritual life of seeking holiness and living out God's call in our life. And so, yeah, I'm grateful for what you've shared about Louis of Granada, because I think there's a lot of insights there and more that we can uncover now in the Sinner's Guide.
Mm-hmm. I think so. He's he was inspired, not scripturally inspired, but given many graces to be able to put this whole this whole program of the ascetical life. He also writes on the mystical life in other writings, but that's different. But this is for everybody. Very few of us are mystics. We can aim for it, yeah, but very few of us know what it's about, but we can understand what it means to grow in grace and virtue.
Well, the Sinner's Guide is available now from Tan Books. You can head on over to their website or wherever you buy your Catholic books and obtain your copy and maybe make it part of your spiritual reading for the season of Lent or any time of the year, so that we can become more holy people seeking the ways of God. So thanks so much, Father Cole, for joining me today.
Sure, pleasure was mine. God bless. Till we meet again.
If you liked today's episode, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you're listening. And don't forget to stay up to date with what Father Edward is doing by following him on Facebook, X, or Instagram at the handle @FrEdwardLooney. Thanks for listening, and please join Father Edward again next time for another inspiring conversation.